Friends, it is my pleasure to have with me on Liberty Dispatch interviews Barry Bussey. Barry Bussey practices law with Bussey Ainsworth Law Firm in Peterborough, Ontario, Canada. He's the author of 210 Degrees Celsius, 16 Ways the Truckers Ignited Canada for the Long Haul. He's also the editor of The Status of Religion and the Public Benefit of Charity Law, which was published in 2020 by Anthem Press, and co-editor with Angus Minouge. And this is going to be the substance of our discussion today: charitable law, registered charities in Canada, and what that all means. So Barry, thank you so much for joining me on Liberty Dispatch interviews. It's great to have you.
Well, it's great to be with you, Andrew.
So I want to set up this first question and our discussion by giving just a little bit of history for people to understand. A couple of years ago, our then former Deputy Prime Minister, Chrystia Freeland, said that he will follow through on the federal government's promise to really crack down on pregnancy care centers that deal in misinformation and disinformation and don't offer the full breadth of women's reproductive rights. And I know that this startled a number of pregnancy care centers, especially the ones that are overtly Christian, because they were concerned that they were holding over their head their charitable status and the removal of it. Fast forward a couple years, just very recently, the Standing Committee on Finance suggested that charities who exist for the sole purpose of the spread of religion, which is one of the four purposes that a charity can exist, that should be removed. You should only have the three purposes, and all of those charities should have their charitable status revoked. And so there's been this move, especially heightened in the last, let's say, 5 years. And then I don't know if you saw that hit piece by the Tyee recently where they grouped together Jacob Rayom and New Apostolic Reformation. And the whole point was at the end of the article to say, why should they have charitable status if they're calling for anarchy and Canada to be taken over by the US? So there's this movement here, and I want to talk about maybe what's behind that. But before we get to that, the question I have is, some people might be thinking, what's the big deal? Okay, so I lose my charitable status as a church or an organization or some parachurch group or a pregnancy care center. All that means is that I can no longer issue charitable receipts, which means our income might take a ding, but people will still give faithfully. That also means I don't get to fill out my GST return twice a year. So, we don't get 70% back of our taxes, but, we'll manage whatever. And there might be some other minor benefits. So what's the big deal? If that's the only thing I lose, then why is everyone so scared and frightened about the losing of charitable status?
Yeah, great question. Well, what people may not realize is the fact that under the Income Tax Act, that if you lose your registered charitable status, there's a 100% revocation tax, which means all the property that the charity owns, in essence, has to be given up by that charity that lost its charitable status, its registered charitable status. So what that'll mean then is that they either have to transfer all of their property, that's including real estate and bank accounts, all that's their property, has to be transferred to another charity to continue on whatever charity work that other charity does, or the government takes it. So that's the revocation tax, and so that is the big hammer that a lot of people don't realize, that if you lose your charitable status, you lose all of your property.
Now, so you said the Income Tax Act, is this also connected to anything in the Charities Act, or are those two separate entities?
So they're separate. So you've got you have so here's what you need to recognize. Under the Canadian Constitution, the regulation of charities falls under the provincial jurisdiction, not the federal. However, because the federal has a broad taxation jurisdiction under the Constitution, the federal government, in essence, is regulating charities via the income tax. Now, that has never been challenged by the court, but certainly this current court, I would think, if it were ever challenged, I'm sure the Supreme Court of Canada would rule in favor of the federal government, just because I see this current makeup of the court um, very flexible when it comes to the Constitution, and also very pro federal government. But nevertheless, the the reality is, on the ground, practically speaking, it's the federal government that's regulating charities by and large through the Income Tax Act, which gives the registered charitable status so that people will give to the charity. And by doing so, they get a receipt. They can then reduce their taxes accordingly. Now, provinces like Ontario and in fact, all of the provinces across the country have the jurisdiction to regulate charities. Not everyone does, but Ontario, Quebec, Alberta, in particular, those three certainly have legislation that is a bit more, how can I say, a bit more robust when it comes to uh, monitoring charities, making sure, like in Ontario, we have the Charities Accounting Act and so forth that deals with making sure that charities are properly using funds and that kind of thing. So there is kind of a patchwork quilt across the country because, generally speaking, the government, the provincial governments have many more fish to fry than just charities. And since the federal government is more or less doing it anyhow through the taxation power, they just as soon leave the bulk of the work done by the federal government.
Now, Barry, has this always been the case? Has it always been the case that the federal government has essentially been regulating charities, number one? And then number two, this revocation tax and the so my understanding is if you lose your charitable status, it triggers the automatic dissolution of the organization, which for most of them is a not-for-profit organization. So your organization's dissolved, and then everything needs to be either paid to another charity or to the government via revocation tax. Has that always been the case? Like, has that always been a part of the Income Tax Act? And then the second question is, has the federal government always functioned this way? Or was there a point where it was entirely under provincial jurisdiction, but this is just another thing that the federal government took within its sphere?
Yeah. Okay. So what I can tell you is that we haven't had the Income Tax Act from the federal government until World War One. So World War One was income taxes when it came around. It was a temporary measure to help support the government with waging war in Europe. That temporary measure has now become ingrained in our soil. So certainly since the bringing about of the Income Tax Act, I haven't done a historical analysis to know where the charity provisions came. However, it's been a common understanding within uh, charities on the provincial level, even. For example, yeah, charities will get tax free as far as their property, their church building is concerned. That was something that's always been part of the provincial apparatus because the province issues, through the municipalities, a property tax. And churches have always been exempt out of that. And that's been, a long time standing, probably ever since the country began. But as far as exactly with the Income Tax Act, I'm unsure. I'd have to search into that a little bit. But certainly, it's in my living memory, it's always been there, and it's been there for a long, long time.
Okay. And so this is not so that's interesting you say that, because that being the case, you would think, for example, that people who are starting organizations, whether it's pregnancy care centers or they're starting churches or going through the legal process of getting their church registered or some sort of other organization,
Yeah.
you would think that this would be the sort of thing, like the reality of what happens if your charitable status is revoked, would be an important piece of information that's either communicated from the get-go from the federal government, or that other people would be talking about this. And so, when maybe 15, 20 years ago now, when we planted a church in Kingston, why didn't I was completely unaware of all of this, and our thinking was, well, you go forward with applying for your charitable status because of the benefits I mentioned earlier. So why? Maybe it's impossible to answer this question, but why does no one know about this? Like, why is this? I mean, all of a sudden now it's coming up to the forefront because they are holding charitable status over the head, almost in an extortion-like way. But why is it that this appears to not be something that's been in the mainstream, or that's something that people know about? Because it seems like this is a pretty significant, a pretty substantial piece of information. What happens if, for whatever reason, your charitable status is gone or your charity doesn't exist? Um, I don't know if you have any thoughts toward that.
Yeah.
Why it
So,
seems we've been silent on this for so long.
well, I just think it's because we had a great sense of entitlement as religious charities. It has always been in this country that the governments have been very deferential towards the religious community, particularly, in Canadian history, it's basically the Christian community in the early days and so on. And now, of course, we got a much more diverse religious community in this country. But there's always been this sense of that the Christian churches have basically had it as almost a right, but it's not a right, it's a privilege. And that's one of the things that we kind of fail to keep in mind. The fact that the government treats churches with kids' gloves, as it were, gives it property tax exemption, gives it exemption when it comes to income tax, gives it a special benefit to the donors of the church by, writing it off on their income tax. That is encouraging people to give to the church because the government has held from the very beginning of this country that the advancement of religion as a charitable purpose, which goes right back to uh, the first legal how can I say enshrinement of in the law has been like in 1601 under the Charitable Uses Act, and it was way back then there was a recognition that advancement of religion is for the public good. It's for public benefit, public common good, and so on. And um, so we've had this sense of entitlement. And so, therefore, when we start up a church, only naturally we're going to be able to get, tax-free status. Plus, our donors are going to be able to get charitable receipts. It's kind of like that sense of entitlement. We've taken it for granted, but really never analyzed it because it was just a given.
Do you see room for maybe a separating or a distinguishing of the, let's say, tax exempt, or property tax exempt, and issuing of receipts, a distinction between them on along these grounds? That I've heard people say before that the historic understanding of churches, let's say in Canada, or what we've inherited from British common law, is because churches are essentially little embassies, right? They're little embassies of Christ's kingdom on this earth. Therefore, as embassies, they almost have a sense of diplomatic immunity, meaning in the same way that embassies are sovereign soil, right? Like the embassy for Nigeria in Canada, I don't know if we have one, but that is sovereign Nigerian soil within Canada, and therefore it is exempt from the same kind of restrictions and laws that Canadians on Canadian soil are, including they can't be taxed because it's sovereign soil. Now, is there any kind of historical understanding, or any kind of historical support for the idea that churches function almost as little sovereign patches of land, and that's why they are exempt from taxes? But that maybe being a different thing from issuing receipts. Like in my mind, I can see how being tax exempt as a piece of sovereign soil is a separate issue from the benefit of being able to issue tax receipts, which is obviously a newer thing, right?
Mhm.
That would be a newer thing than being exempt from taxes altogether. Is there any kind of historical framework for that?
Yeah,
Is that
no, that's an interesting idea, but it's certainly not one that's in our law. Our law is very clear that churches are subject to the law, period. I mean, that there is no exemption from the law other than the fact that there are particular benefits that are given to the religious community because it's seen as doing a public good. So, in that sense, because of its charitable nature, but not because of this concept of sovereignty. Now, what is interesting, though, there is within, I would say that there is an argument that is not like that argument of sovereignty is not unfamiliar to me because it's something that comes out of uh, you know um, Abraham Kuyper, I think it is in the Netherlands. The idea of the two kingdoms, church and state. John Calvin had this idea. Luther had similar ideas, but it was the idea that um, there needs to be this separation of church and state. But what that separation of church and state means is that the church has its own particular role in society that the government should not be imposing and and the church shouldn't be imposing on government and so on. And certainly within the Enlightenment time frame, we even got a further distinction of that, where we see that the Enlightenment influences, for example, in the United States, where there was this idea of separation of church and state. But that was really a development of the 1960s, because what's interesting is in the United States, there were established churches at the state level. It was just that the federal government couldn't have a state church,
yeah, all the state
which,
constitution, many of the state constitutions baked into their individual constitutions were strict observance to the Sabbath and the understanding that there was a state, like state as in not the one when we think of the state, which is the entire federal government apparatus, but state churches.
yeah,
But the issues on the federal level, you do not have a federal governing
yeah,
religious
Congress shall
body.
make no law, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, establishing religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof. And so that is like ingrained in the Bill of Rights. In Canada, we've actually had a more relaxed position than that, because of the Anglican Church, the Church of England's influence in Canada, where the English Church has always been an established church of the government in Great Britain, and in many ways it acted as the established church in many parts of Canada. And I'm from Newfoundland originally, and that certainly was the stay down there back in the day, um, because it was from the Anglican Church that you generally would get the prime ministers of Newfoundland or the governor generals of Newfoundland and so on. So, but the thing is that there is no uh, sense of the church being a a sovereign body, and so therefore has some form of diplomatic status. What's interesting, though, with which feeds into this idea, though, is the idea that a lot of uh, churches have taken the idea, well, the state should not come into the church, and therefore you could have it as a refuge. So, for example, if there's literally refugees or a sense of asylum within the church, away from the state. And so people have done that, but it's not because it's in the law necessarily. It's just simply there's been this mutual respect between the church and state. Now, that doesn't mean that there isn't a development or could be a development um, of political or religio-political thinking or philosophy and that kind of thing. But in the law, it's not there.
Mhm. Well, and this, yeah, and you're. I'm glad you made that distinction because this ultimately, and we don't necessarily have to get into this. I have a couple questions back on the original topic, but this opens up a whole other discussion, namely, if you do have laws that are ultimately themselves immoral, and we would say lawless because they are in direct opposition to what is true, good, and beautiful in the way that the Lord has made the world to work,
Mhm.
then churches would say, for example, during the COVID era, churches would say, well, Quarantine Act, Reopening Act, Ontario, be damned. God has not granted you the authority to
Yep.
come into the gathering of God's people and tell them how they are and are not to worship unless they are breaking God's law, like sacrificing children. Then you can step in and save them. But if they're singing without masks on, whatever the law says is distinct from ultimately what is lawful, because God is the one who grants both authority and the one who deems laws righteous or unrighteous. So, but I'm glad you made that distinction according to the law, because even in this discussion, you'll have people who say, I think foolishly, whatever, whatever is in the books, quote unquote, that is what is moral and God honoring, and that's just the way it should be, which I think is wrong. But you have other people that will say, well, anything that's in the books, any sort of laws that exist surrounding this, they're all bad because the state's corrupt and we don't have to abide by any of them. We have to avoid both. I think we have to avoid both of those ditches,
Mm.
lest we be, statists or scofflaws. But
Yeah, and the reality is, there can be civil disobedience on things, but every one recognizes if you're going to be involved in civil disobedience, you're still going to be subject to whatever the law is, and you may
exactly,
end up
you have to deal with the
suffering as a result.
consequences.
Yeah,
Yeah. So my question is you've been observing this, and before we started recording, you said that you've been aware of and concerned with this for a while,
yeah,
which I would have to confess, even for myself, as someone who I've tried to be kind of have my finger on the pulse of these important issues. Really, it's only inside of the last 5 years that I would say all this has come to the surface. And what sparked it is when Christia Freeland said we're coming for pregnancy care centers, and I went to go meet with our local pregnancy care center. And in meeting with them, they informed me, sort of local where I was living before.
right.
And the director of the pregnancy care center said, yeah, if they take our charitable status, we lose everything. I'm like, what do you mean you lose everything?
Hmm.
Like, we lose and she spelled it out for me.
Yeah.
And I thought, how does no one know this? This is devastating. Your building, your money, like everything.
Hmm.
Um, why do you think, as you've been observing this for a while, why the play now? Like,
Okay,
right?
sure.
Because and let me maybe put it in a few different ways. There's a sense that obviously Canada has been on a little bit of a legal jurisprudence trajectory for the last, let's say, 40 years or so, where it seems that our Supreme Court is an activist legislating court, that the Constitution's a living tree. So there seems to be a legal movement in Canada that we've observed over the last 40 years or so. But you also have a clear cultural shift in our country. So these two streams are kind of running concurrently. So what in those two streams do you see why now this is starting to bubble up, where it's overt, we need to remove their charitable status, or at least it's much more overt than it's ever been in my lifetime.
Well, I think what's happened, and you pointed out about the activism of the courts. I remember being in law school in the early or late 80s into the early 90s. And I remember one professor, Ian Hunter, who I went to or University of Western Ontario at the time, now Western University in London. And Ian was like very critical of the Charter of Rights and how it was going to give tons of power to judges. The judges are now going to be making law instead of applying law and all of that kind of thing. And I remember thinking, because I thought, hey, I remember I was in high school when, in 1982, we had the Constitution Act 1982, the Charter of Rights and Freedoms. The Queen signed it and all that kind of stuff. It was all a big fanfare. And it was like, okay, well, what's so wrong about that? But then as time has gone on and as my career has gone on, I'm like, oh, yeah, I can see exactly what Professor Hunter was talking about. And that is that when you give power to make law to a group, a very educated group, nonetheless, 9 judges, 9 lawyers, and many of those lawyers, certainly a significant, yeah, a number of them have had very little experience in the practice of law. I would say the majority have been, but generally speaking, into the actual day-to-day practice, in a small town practice, that kind of a thing. Often they're from bigger firms if they are practicing law, but they're not really down where the people are, as it were. And so there's a lot of philosophizing, and there's a lot of just this grand thinking, a utopian type mindset that goes on in the law schools and all the rest, and you get you know the Supreme Court of Canada is heavily influenced by the law schools across the country, and so whatever fad or whatever hip idea and concepts that are being promulgated down at the law schools are fed right into the Supreme Court. There's a whole analysis as to why that's the case, but I won't get into that now. But nevertheless, the point is that these judges are making law in the same way that we've got philosophers like Jacques Rousseau, a very secular mindset, and this idea of the perfectibility of mankind and all that kind of stuff, without this tragic view of man, which has always been one of those characteristics of our Western civilization, where we said, what, the reality is that within the human being there is this essence of making bad choices, right? Alexander Solzhenitsyn talks about the line between good and evil runs through every human heart, and so we got this philosophizing aspect, and one of the things that's become more and more influential in recent times is as society has become more secular, as and we see it in the Trinity Western University Law School case, where the Christian university wanted to have a law school, and everyone was up in arms because the law school had the view that marriage was one man and one woman, and therefore, if you go to that school, you're unqualified to be a lawyer, even though you've done all of the required courses that you would have to take in order to be accepted to write a bar exam and all of that. But that was all thrown out the window because of the religious views of the school. And so now ideology has become a big play. And so what happened was, in that particular case, and this is something that has taken years to develop. So by the time you get to the 2018 decision at the Supreme Court of Canada on Trinity Western Law School case, you've had 20, 30 more years of different ideas that have percolated up to the top, whereby the idea and the concept that if the government gives a privilege, that the government is supporting whoever receives that privilege. And so, for example, a lot of people made reference to the Bob Jones University case down in the United States, where at a Christian university, Bob Jones was very much against intermarriage relationships and interracial dating and all that kind of stuff. That was forbidden on this campus. And eventually they lost their charitable status. That case has been applied now and was used in the Trinity Western case, whereby the lawyer for the Canadian Bar Association was before the court and was saying that the time has now come where government must ensure that when they give a privilege, that the organizations are in essence in harmony with government ideology, which is extraordinary. And so during the argument on December 17, 2017, at the hearing, Justice Malcolm Rowe says to the lawyer, he says, "How about my theoretical Jesuit Institute? You can't get in unless you're a Jesuit. You can't become a Jesuit unless you're a Catholic priest. And you can't become a Catholic priest unless you're a man. Should their tax-exempt status be struck down because of that?" And the lawyer replied, "It is not the case before us." "Yes, I know," said Justice Rowe, "but is it not the logic of what you're putting to us?" And then the lawyer replied, "It is the logic I'm putting to you. There are limits to what the state should be called upon to support." Okay? So again, the analogy is you give accreditation to this law school, and you are now supporting it. So therefore, you're supporting marriage as one man and one woman. That's the argument. So you are right. We are at that threshold, and we can't back away from it. So now what's happened with Chrystia Freeland, when she said what she said, as you quoted her, she's basically saying there is no way that the federal government is going to give registered charitable status to an institution or to a group, the pregnancy care center that advocates a pro-life position. Why? Well, because that goes against the government's position. That goes against this idea of charter values, which is another host that we could do 5 or 6 talks on charter values. But the point is that this is now the government imposing its ideological position using the charitable status as the mechanism so that in order to maintain compliance with their view. And we saw it with the Canada Summer Jobs Act application process back in 2018, and it's still done today, whereby the government will not give any money to churches or charities that have unacceptable views with respect to their own philosophy and so on, their religious teaching. They're not going to get any money to hire students in the summer. And this is the process. This is what's going on. And so now the idea is that the problem with a lot of churches in the government's mindset is that they're teaching the wrong thing. And so therefore they need to lose their charitable status. Now, it doesn't say that in the Finance Committee, but it's definitely what the thinking is and what's going on behind the scenes.
Inflation through the roof.
Food costs went up 10.6% in February.
Censorship of dissident voices, freezing of bank accounts.
Justin Trudeau invoking emergency powers against the truckers. Banks can now freeze their personal accounts, the accounts of anyone linked to the Freedom Convoy.
Digital surveillance and communism spreading.
What do we want?
Basic income!
With the basic income, I felt a sense of security because I didn't have to worry about not going hungry, and I didn't have to worry about being kicked out of my apartment.
The government is on the verge of bankruptcy, and they're coming for your money.
Canada's federal debt increasing in real time, now surpassing $1.2 trillion. This debt is draining taxpayer dollars, with interest alone costing $54 billion this year.
It's time to break free and start saving in money they can't take from you. Since 2013, the folks at Bull Bitcoin have one mission: destroy central banking. Bull Bitcoin is the most trusted Bitcoin company in Canada. They empower you to buy, sell, and pay bills with Bitcoin. They are 100% non-custodial, which means that you always maintain full control over your Bitcoin, allowing you to reclaim your financial sovereignty and secure your wealth for the future. Their customer support will assist you throughout the whole process, helping you get your hands on the hardest money ever created. Escape their financial gulag, click on the link below, and start buying Bitcoin today. So what they're, interestingly enough, what they're admitting without saying it is something that the left and progressives historically have criticized Christians over, which is you can't legislate morality, but what they're showing is that laws are legislated morality.
Of
it's
course
just
they are.
whose
Absolutely.
morality,
Yep.
right?
Yeah, exactly.
So this is the case now. We're moving in this direction. So you kind of outlined legally the trajectory that we've seen. Culturally, obviously, as a culture becomes more secular, it becomes more hostile to what's true. So it's funny, even though a culture becomes secular, you still see the linking of arms between, Muslims and woke people, because they both have their sights set on the destruction of Western culture, which is biblical Christianity. So it's not necessarily, and personally, I found this to be the case during the COVID era, that I didn't hear a ton of stories about mosques. There were some synagogues, but a ton of stories about mosques or other religious institutions that were cracked down on so hard. It seemed that there was this hyper focus on the Christian church. So if this is the case, if this is the trajectory that things are moving, our culture is moving a certain way, why? How do I want to frame this question? What does this mean? Do you perceive? So they say they want to go for all religion or all charities that exist for the purpose of, the promulgation of religion or for the
Yeah.
purpose of the spreading of religion. So that's the play. They're not saying we're going for Christians specifically. They're not saying that we're going for those who would push, what Bill C4 says, harmful myths and stereotypes. We're not going for them specifically. We're just going to go after all religious groups. How is that? My wife and I were talking about this. How is that going to play out? Because I don't see a Canada where they're going to start targeting mosques because Islam's a protected people class in the criminal code. So how is it going to roll out? Is it really going to be the case that they're going to make the pitch for every charity that has its charitable status because it pushes religion? Or do you think they're going to find some sort of way to make exceptions that really they're going to go after the real enemy, which is the white Christian cisgender male, right? The king of all oppressors.
Right. So first of all, recognize that the government is uh, basically saying they're going to, or the suggestion is to take away advancement of religion as a charitable purpose. So therefore, if you are a religious community, a Christian church or Islamic or Jewish, whatever, you are now called upon to prove that you are of some public benefit to receive the um, the benefit of charitable status.
Does that mean that you need to show that you fulfill one of the other three purposes?
Wow. Now, so this is it. So
Right,
now,
because it's poverty, education, and
Yeah. So
general good,
that's
I
right.
think. Yeah.
Yeah. So it's poverty, education, advancement of religion is third head. Fourth head is um, uh, any other charity that the courts rule is of a public benefit. So the reality, yeah. So that's going to be the question. Okay. So what does that mean, and how do you prove public benefit? So I'm going to. So the reality is that the government will like. We don't know yet how that is going to work, but we do have an example over in the UK where they have already now taken away advancement of religion as a public benefit. And so now what they have to do is the churches over there have got to show why they are providing a public benefit. And there's different ways in which you can do that. We've got, I should point out, there's, let me just, there's, and this kind of gets back to this other idea of, okay, how to show how we can, what do we do with the situation we find ourselves? So part of this is going to be recognizing that there is now incumbent upon the religious community to show the public benefit, and you can do it by four ways, in my view. One is quantitative benefits. By that I mean show something concrete that there is a benefit that your church is providing. So, for example, Cardis, which is a Christian think tank in Ottawa, has put together what they call the Cardis Halo, like a Halo project, and so they've studied churches, and they found that in their study that for every dollar that a congregation spends, the local community receives an average of $3.39 in economic benefit. In other words, the halo effect for Canada for just having churches on your corner in your local community is an estimated value of $18.2 billion a year for the Canadian economy. Now, how does that work out? Well, there are things like it provides a space for the community to come and meet for various programmings that goes on. Programmings for young people, programmings for elderly people. There's all kinds of oftentimes food and clothing shelters, food and clothing distribution that goes on in the church, or Just even basically having your Sunday morning or your Saturday morning programs for the community that teach, religious teachings and so on, which then leads us to the qualitative benefits of churches, and those include such things as I should just also point out here as well. Let me just see here. Yeah, so the qualitative benefits are things that come from religion itself: social stability, strong family units, reducing domestic abuse, lower crime rates. When people are attending church, we see those kinds of stats. Mental and physical health benefits, a sense of purpose, social capital, where there's a network of friends, which helps with helping people try to find jobs. I mean, you talk about a great system where just meeting together on the weekend, and someone is without work and someone else has got a business, says, hey, you know what, I could use someone over here. Those kind of things. Civic engagement. Religious communities are more inclined to volunteer in other community activities that are not even non-religious. They also tend to give a lot more, even though they give a lot to their churches, they also give a lot to other groups like the Cancer Society and so on. Then just helping with social service needs, whether it's the elderly, the prisoners, families in need, emergency relief, medical care contributions that many church families help when there's a disaster in a church family member loses a house in a fire. I mean, it's incredible the amount of benefits that flow from a church community. We've got the other recognition is the political side of a church. Now, lots of people will look at it and say, okay, well, churches are not to be political and all that kind of stuff. Well, that's so fascinating, because where is it that politicians love to go when there's an election going on? They love to come to the church. They love to speak to the church. And there's a good reason for it, because 53% of Canadians, for example, claim to be Christian, even to today. You got 35,000 religious charities in Canada, of which most of them are Christian. We got political necessity requires that Christian organizations are respectfully treated as other community groups. Why? Just because of the numbers. So there's those political, practical realities. And the other thing is, it's very interesting. I've been reading a number of different non-religious authors, and one, for example, Jeffrey Stout, he points out that we need to keep in mind that the secularist plan to remove religious communities from the public square, he says, is bound to have unintended consequences. Divisive polarization and antagonism, he said, you can expect to see it increase. And so there is that political reality. And of course, there's always the balancing of freedom of religion and the rights of others in a pluralistic society. But if you're going to put pressure on the religious communities, don't be surprised if there's going to be some kind of pushback. We need to recognize, as another author, William Galston, points out, that civic totalism, where the state decides what liberties to grant, modify, or revoke at will, is not where we want to be. And so these are the kinds of things we need to...
not where we want to be, Barry. That's not where we want to be. But the reality is that is where many want to be. Like, this is the reality of Marxism, which the reality of Marxism means that you need communism to solve the problem that Marxism addresses. But the only way to make communism a reality is by implementing socialism, which is the state then doing the work to create the utopia. So we obviously don't want that.
No.
But there are a lot of people that do want that, because they think that is the way to usher in the utopia that we've just been unable to attain as of yet, despite the fact we've been trying for so long to implement these ideologies.
Yeah, no, and no question about it. No question about it.
And so
So
this is what you're outlining is basically our pitch, right? So
yeah,
our pitch to the federal government, because we know this is true about ourselves, right? We
yeah,
know that, I'm convinced that the reason why you had a spike in suicides, domestic abuse, and substance abuse, yes, I think it had something to do with telling men they can't work. You tell a man he can't work, he's been made to work, he's been made to produce. You tell him he can't do that, you basically strike at the core of his identity. It creates all sorts of problems. But I'm convinced that the reason why we saw a spike in all of these issues is because people couldn't go to church anymore. People couldn't see their friend group. People couldn't actually connect with those that they love, that who love them. And then naturally, this creates a surge in these issues. And as a friend of mine, Aaron Rock, has pointed out, that churches who are, if they're effective at meeting people's spiritual needs, we know biblically that a lot of mental, psychological, social issues are not actually mental, psychological, social issues. Those are just the symptoms of deeper spiritual issues.
mm,
So if the church can actually minister to people, it actually ends up putting a significantly less strain on the healthcare system, because people won't have to avail themselves of healthcare needs or counseling. And so what you've outlined is basically what Christians should be saying in an effort to dissuade not only the broader state, but the public. And say, you might not agree with what I believe. You might think that it's problematic, but let me just outline for you the existence of our church and the ability for us to have charitable status and the benefits and kind of circumstances that come from that are actually a tremendous benefit to our community, our province, and our country. This is our pitch then.
yeah, yeah, yeah. And I think that's important to make that pitch. And I think that we have not been doing that because we've had this sense of, well, we're entitled. Well, no, we're not entitled. I mean, we were entitled in the sense that everyone understood that, but everyone doesn't understand. They don't even know what goes on in a church. And, they have these, crazy ideas about what might be going on in a church or that kind of thing. So the reality is that churches have a role in letting the society around them know what's happening. And I mean, as Christ said in the Gospels, the whole idea is that it's supposed to be a bit of leaven in the bread, right? I mean, it spreads, and you've got to. I think part of the problem of our current environment is that the church has been way too insular and not been getting out and holding true to their faith but recognizing and help people understand their positions because, and it's uncomfortable, right? I mean, reality is, I mean, society has moved so far from what many within the Christian faith would have considered, the traditional Christian beliefs and so on. And so it's uncomfortable to have, discussions in society at large today, but that's, I think, is part of the necessity of engaging with the community. And I think here's another thing to keep in mind. People say, well, okay, so if we lose our charitable status, people still give. Well, I had a conversation with a preacher of a congregation who very outspoken in this country, and he informed me that when he lost his charitable status at his church, the donations went way, way down. They didn't go up; they went down. And so there is also, I think, an element here as well for the church to ensure that they educate their people to recognize that, hey, you know what? You give not because you're going to get a tax receipt. You give because of your heart and soul is in the mission of the church. And that regardless of whether you receive a charitable receipt at the end of the day is immaterial because of your religious commitment to give. And this is something that a lot of people don't really experience and understand until it's taken away. And times are going to be rough. I wonder sometimes, to be honest with you, that if this idea metastasizes so that it goes not only from the federal government, but metastasizes to the provincial level, where governments there, I mean, you look at a lot of churches, for example, they tend to be in prime real estate locations. Why? Because churches want to be high profile. They're part of the community. And then suddenly the uh, the local municipality says, well, you know what? This is an opportunity for us to get more tax revenue. And so let's tax churches. Let's just forget this idea of, if the federal government is getting rid of advancement of religion, then we should do it the same at the local level on the property tax issue. Now that can be an even bigger issue for some churches because, um, you know, having to pay property tax and prime real estate is very expensive today.
Yeah. And lest anyone think you're being an alarmist, I just want to draw everyone's attention to what happened during the COVID era. I'll just use one example. In the state of New York, I remember there was a press conference held by then Governor Cuomo, basically said, you have all these abandoned businesses, these sort of abandoned buildings, abandoned warehouses, all these abandoned structures because people lost their business because of COVID, lockdowns, blah, 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 blah. And he basically said, and the state government our plan is to step in, is to purchase these, obviously at super cheap rate. And we're gonna turn them into schools, or we're gonna turn them into, government subsidized housing. And I found it curious that the same state government that shut down businesses, that ruined people's livelihoods, and that basically made these buildings empty, is then the same one that came along just a year later and said, "Oh, don't worry, we'll buy them for super cheap, and we'll save them. We'll turn them into weed dispensaries, and we'll take all the money for that too." And so, lest anyone think, "Oh, that would never." A world where a municipality could look at prime real estate and leverage lawfare in order to punish or put people in a position where they have to give up their property so that they could buy it and use it for their benefit. They would never do that. That's exactly what they did do. So that's not so far-fetched an idea.
Well, and the thing is, there are municipalities in this country right now are always pushing the edge. I get phone calls from various churches who are facing challenges because municipalities are tightening up the property tax exemption. Like, for example, they'll say, okay, the actual worship sanctuary part of the church, okay, that's tax free, but any other part of the church, whether it's used for school, not so much for a school, but if it was used like as a parish hall, or, these kinds of things, where there's other things going on throughout the week, if there's a daycare, for example, if there's a daycare at a church building, well, that's not going to be tax free, and so forth. So there's always this, the line is never, okay, well, this is a church building, and therefore it's tax-free. There's always a moving of the lines depending on the local municipalities and their needs and all the rest. I mean, it's complicated. There's a lot of ins and outs of it and so forth. I'm not saying it's cut and dry, but the reality is that there's always these challenges. And now with this particular recommendation from the Finance Committee, and it just reaffirmed what I experienced when I was there at the Trinity Western case, hearing the arguments going on in the court, and which is why it led to us putting together this book of different people from Europe, from Australia, and so on. And we were talking about, okay, what is the public benefit of religion? And should it be still considered, a charity? And so anyhow, so that's kind of where my mind has been for the last little while on this issue. And for a while, it's kind of like, no big deal, but it is a big deal now.
So Barry, I have a couple more questions for you. Do you
Sure.
have a few more minutes to stick around?
Sure.
Okay, so I have a couple questions. I want to talk about legal recourse for charities and churches. I want to ask you this question. Going forward, new churches or new Christian organizations, how should they approach getting their charitable status in light of where things are moving and the trajectory we've seen? So I want to ask some of those questions. But if you our audience want to see and hear that discussion, you're going to have to head over to ldcanada.substack.com. You're going to have to sign on, become a paid subscriber. For the first little bit of this interview has been for everyone. But if you want to hear the rest of this discussion and hear the answers to those questions, you have to become a paid subscriber, support the work we do at ldcanada.substack.com. And before we leave YouTube and Rumble and all of our free subscribers, Barry, where can people follow you, what you're doing, this book, or any other books or information, social media handles that you want to communicate? Sure. I want to give you a chance to share all that.
Yeah, sure. I run not only do I practice law, but I also have a foundation, firstfreedoms.ca, First Freedoms Foundation, firstfreedoms, plural, .ca, and also busseyainsworth.ca, so busseyainsworth.ca, all one word. And you can follow me on X at Barry W. Bussey, and I'm found there. So, yeah.
In the books, where can people find not only this book you're mentioning, the one you wrote in 2020, but even, the book on the trucker convoy,
Yep.
or the one about, lessons learned from COVID? I know there was another book that's been published recently. Where can people find those?
So that would be at, you just go to amazon.ca, type in my name, Barry W. Bussey, and you'll find the books that I've been involved with there.
Okay, so to our regular audience, until next time, Galatians 5:1. Liberty Dispatch has been brought to you by SDG Media. If you want to stay in touch with us and all things Liberty Dispatch, join our email list, or support the show, head over to ldcanada.substack.com.